Hello, welcome to another online lecture on principles of computer security. In this week's lecture, we are going to be focusing on block ciphers and the data encryption standard. In the previous weeks, we have talked about the basic or the classical encryption standards and encryption mechanisms. And from this week onwards, we are going to be focusing on what we categorize as modern encryption standards. And block ciphers and data encryption standard is one of the topics that we are going to be discussing under that. So, if you recall what we have covered so far in this course, uh, the basic idea of a cipher or encryption is about a few things. So, we want to start from a plain text. So, we will start from a plain text from the sender, and then we will use a function, an encryption function, and then that will be transmitted through what can be categorized as an insecure channel, where there may be the risk of someone eavesdropping or someone listening in onto that conversation or communication. Then at the receiving point, that message can be decrypted and the plain text can be received again, or we can get the plain text back. And in terms of the encryption and the decryption functions that we have, the main idea behind these two functions is they may use keys as a way to operate these functions, and once a plain text is encrypted, we call that as the ciphertext. So that is the ciphertext, that is the product of encryption, and that is what is normally transmitted through the insecure channel, and then the ciphertext is decrypted again to get the plain text by the receiver. And then we also briefly touched upon two types of ciphers depending on the type of keys we have. That is, if we have the same key at the receiver and sender's end, we will call that the symmetric key encryption. So we have the single key at both ends for the encryption and decryption. And then in public key encryption, we have one key that is known publicly and the other key is secret. So we have one public key and one secret key. So that is public key encryption. We will look at public key encryption in a bit more detail later on in the course, but today we are going to be focusing on symmetric key encryption. Then when we think about the requirements of these encryptions, we can think about what were the requirements historically. For example, World War II was one of the heydays of encryption, or encryption became a key part of a lot of communication. So when we think about those days, the requirement was it had to be used by people with limited capabilities, limited resources. It has to be somewhat simple, not requiring a lot of equipment, instrumentation to do encryption and decryption. And in addition to that, there was an assumption that the attacker sometimes may also know the cryptographic algorithms and implementations. So the key which we used for the encryption became the more secure part, of the one that needs to be secured a lot. And there was the assumption that the attacker may also have access to a lot of plain text and ciphertext, and they may try to break the encryption. So that was the nature of security those days. Whereas nowadays, it is fairly easy for an attacker to have a lot of ciphertext and plain text, collect a lot of ciphertext and plain text for a particular encryption algorithm, particular encryption mechanism, especially a well-known encryption algorithm, for example. And in many ways, these algorithms are these days implemented in devices, in digital devices, in computers, in mobile phones, in processors. So they are implemented in these devices, and so the expectation is these are not directly used by humans. These are or rather the algorithms are directly used by the software and hardware components, rather than humans are manually utilizing these capabilities. And one of the main requirements that we have with these ciphers is they need to be resilient to a lot of computing power, because one of the main challenges that we have is we have the ability to have a fairly high amount of computing power put in one of these attacks. So then they should be resilient to such situations. That is, when an adversary can utilize a lot of computing power, how we can manage that situation, how we can manage that attack. When we think about symmetric key encryption, particularly where the same key is used by the sender and the receiver, there are two main categories or categorizations we can have there as block ciphers and stream ciphers. So the main difference between block ciphers and stream ciphers is how they process the information, or how they take a message and do the encryption and decryption with them. So in block ciphers, what they do is they take the message as blocks. So if there is a message, they will break them into a number of blocks, and then they may encrypt and decrypt them as these blocks. On the other hand, stream ciphers may take the information and process them as individual bits or bytes that are available in the message. So the main difference being, in block ciphers, it is a block of data that is encrypted and decrypted, whereas in stream ciphers, it is individual bit or byte that is encrypted and decrypted. But in reality, most of the commonly used modern ciphers are block ciphers, because they are better in many sort of performance basis, in many sort of applications. They are more suited, so they are the most commonly used type of ciphers when comparing block ciphers and stream ciphers. The main difference is how they break apart the message for encryption and decryption purposes. So if we take, for example, the stream cipher, for example, what we have is we will have to get a bit stream of information, and then we will have to get the key also as a bit stream, and then we will do the encryption function and get the ciphertext, and we may do the reverse in terms of the bit stream of the ciphertext and the cryptographic bit stream for the key, and then we will get the plain text. So that is for stream cipher. Whereas for block cipher, we will have a key, we will have a plain text as a block, we will put it through the encryption function, and we will get the ciphertext as a block again. So when it comes to modern ciphers, as I said, block ciphers are the most commonly used type of cryptographic algorithms. And they are mainly used for the purposes of secrecy, purposes of authentication, in terms of building those authentication and secrecy services, some of which we discussed previously as well. In today's lecture, we are going to be focusing on data encryption standard, or the DES. But in the upcoming lectures, we will also focus on advanced encryption standard, or AES. Even though AES has become the main encryption standard eclipsing DES, we will start with DES to better illustrate the design of a block cipher and the basic principles of block cipher. And in the upcoming lectures, we will be focusing on what are the key differences in AES and how that is implemented. So the basic idea behind block ciphers, and particularly DES as well, is what is called a Feistel cipher structure. So the basic idea behind Feisel's cipher structure is about the way that it is more like a structure using which a number of different encryption algorithms can be implemented. So it is not a single encryption algorithm, it is rather a structure or a framework using which different encryption algorithms can be implemented, and DES, or the data encryption standard, is one example. And the main thing that we expect from these block ciphers is we won't be able to sort of encrypt and decrypt messages, but in a more efficient manner. So that is the main requirement that we have. Even though we are processing them as blocks, the efficiency and how faster and how quicker we can do the encryption and decryption becomes an important part. Then we would ideally have a block size, splitting the message, splitting it into a particular size of blocks, and then we do some form of substitution, confusion. We will discuss some of those, and we will come up with this encryption there. So that is the basic idea we have with block ciphers. So we are taking them in as blocks, we are breaking them into these blocks, and when we are using what is called the Feistel cipher structure to do that. So the basic idea of the Feistel cipher structure can be illustrated as this. So in Feistel cipher structure, what we would start with is, we would start with a block. We would start with the block of message, and then we will split it into two. Then what we would do is, we would take one of these sides. So then the message will be split into two blocks, two parts, the left and the right. And then what happens is, for the right part of the message, will be put through some function, and then the result will be XORed with the left part, and that result will become the new right part, and the left part itself will become the new left part. So what happens is, there is a function and the result will go this way, and then it will come this way, and this function will use a particular key, or part of a key. Then the same will be repeated again a function with another part of the key, and again what will happen is, this side comes here and this side comes here. So that this basic structure is what we call as the Feistel cipher structure, and most of these block ciphers, symmetric block ciphers, are based on this particular structure. So when we think about a basic or a block cipher, an ideal block cipher, what we would expect is, we can take a small number of bits, like for example a 4-bit input can be decoded into a 16-bit, and then that 16-bit is the one that what is going to be encrypted, the confusion and substitution is going to work, and then that 16-bit will again be turned into another 4-bit. So that is the ideal block cipher structure that we would expect to have. So what we are trying to do is the confusion or the substitution, the encryption part happens here. One of the basic theories that we use with these block ciphers is what is called substitution permutation ciphers, or Claude-Shannon ciphers, or substitution permutation networks. So the basic idea with the substitution permutation networks is they will have two particular components, a substitution component and a permutation component, and they would provide both confusion and diffusion to the message. So there will be two separate cryptographic operations. One operation will do the substitution, as we discussed in the previous week, and the other one will add permutation. This will permutate the available messages among themselves. So one is replacements, then adding the changing them over in the permutation. So these two cryptographic operations combined together, we would call them substitution permutation ciphers, or the Shannon-Claude ciphers, or SP networks. So the main idea we have with these SP networks is that they give us confusion and diffusion for message and key. So what is confusion and diffusion? So the idea behind confusion and diffusion is, one of the issues that we early identified with sort of classical encryption mechanisms is that they don't have, or they have the problem of statistical analysis. So the message can be analyzed for statistical probabilities of the language and so on, and people can make guesses out of it. So the basic requirement that confusion and diffusion provides is obscuring the statistical properties of the original message. So using SP networks, we get both one, diffusion, so that is, it eliminates the statistical structure of the plain text, so it eliminates that structure, and then confusion, it again combines the ciphertext and the key in a complex manner, so that the relationship between the key and the ciphertext are not very well known. So just because you give a particular key and a particular ciphertext, it gives an output, but that relationship is not very directly known, or it's not very easily guessable. So that is what we expect, or we try to achieve using the SP networks, and by getting the confusion and diffusion parts within the cipher operations. Now let's look at a data encryption standard. So data encryption standard is a popular block cipher, as we mentioned previously, and it was originally developed by IBM as Lucifer cipher, and one of the people that were part of it is the Feistel, about the Feistel cipher structure, the same scientist. And in the Lucifer cipher, it had a 64-bit data blocks and a 128-bit key. So in the original Lucifer cipher, it was a 64-bit data block and a 128-bit key. But then when it became a data encryption standard, or a national standard for the USA, for that matter, the data encryption standard, when it was adopted as the data encryption standard, and one of the main changes was the key became a 56-bit key, and the blocks still remained 64-bit blocks. It was very widely used throughout the 80s and 90s, but later on a number of issues, number of shortcomings of DES were identified, and as a result, AES, or the Advanced Encryption Standard, has become the de facto standard these days, but it is still used in certain places. There is still a bit of use in a number of places for legacy reasons and so on. But there were some controversies around its security as well. One of the main controversies was when it became a public standard, and the choice of a 56-bit key versus the 128-bit key for security, or the key selection. But the main thing that we need to understand about these keys and encryption algorithms is having the largest key is not always the best idea, because when we have a larger key, then the process of encryption and decryption becomes more complex, more resource hungry, more resource consuming, and sometimes it may not be the ideal option. So for the time when DES was introduced, that 56-bit key was a good option, so then it was used. But then later on, there were some with the advancement of computing and so on, there were some issues or some shortcomings with DES. Hence, it was replaced by AES. But it still has some use in some legacy applications and so on. Now let's look at data encryption standard of the DES encryption, how it works broadly. So as I said, it also follows the Feistel structure. So we have this breaking the message into left and right halves, and then the combination of the left half and the encrypted, or the whatever the cipher operations, crypto operations done, that part is combined into the new right half, and the original right half becomes the left half. So that is the basic idea that we have, and we will have the key, and we will use that for that particular operation here. And one of the main things is we will repeat this for 16 times. We will go through this, we will repeat this operation 16 times. So what we will start with is, for example, we may start with two parts of the message. They will go like this, then they will go like this. So what we will end up is with this sort of crisscrossing operation, and each of these operations will, or each of these steps will add both confusion and diffusion as they go along. So then the basic idea of the basic requirement of will be satisfied by using a number of steps repeated. And then one of the important or interesting thing about these Feistel structures is the decryption is fairly straightforward or fairly similar, such that what we need to do is we will need to feed in the ciphertext from the top again, from the same structure. The only thing is we will have to reverse the keys from the last key to the first key in the reverse order, and at the end we will get the decrypted message. There will be some additional resources relevant to explaining this that will be shared on your LMS as well. So again, if we look at the encryption process in a bit more detail, so what we have is we will take the plain text, and we will go through with the plain text for a number of rounds. We will go through a number of rounds with the plain text. At the same time, we will take the key, and then we will split the key into number of sub keys and or round keys, and we will use those keys for each of these steps, each of these 16 steps, and at the end we will get the ciphertext. So that is the one of the main things that we will do in DES. So the first part is about the permutation and the data processing part. The second part is about the key processing or the key selection part. So So when we think about the initial permutation, what we do here is we take the data and we take the input bits, and we will combine the left and right halves into creating a structure like this. We will combine, say, the 32-bit input, and we will get it into a 48-bit output. Then for each of these round structures, or each of these round structures, what we again do is we will combine that 48-bit part that we got from the initial permutation, and then we will combine that with the 48-bit subkey, and we will get the 32-bit permuted. So we will go through a number of substitution boxes. We will do the substitutions first, and then we will do the permutation, and we will get the final outcome there. So as we talked about the ideal block cipher structure, we will start with 32 bits. We'll go to more bits here, and then we'll come back to 32 bits again. So this is the basic operational structure for DES. So when we think about the substitution boxes particularly, they are going to do, say, there will be 8 substitution boxes, each of which will accept 6-bit input data, and then they will produce 4-bit output. So they will start with 48 bits and take that down to 32 bits. So that is the main thing that we do with these substitution boxes. Then, as I said, the decryption is fairly straightforward. Is just the reverse of using the keys in the reverse order. So we take the sub keys. We will take the same sub keys that we have used in our encryption part, but we will use them in the reverse order. So we will go through the same structure. We will go through the same sort of Feistel structure in the 16 rounds. We will go through them in the same order. But if we had used, say, K1, K2, K3, and K15 in the 16 in the initial encryption, we will use, for the decryption, we will go with the K16, K15, and K2, K1, and so on. So we will go with the keys in the reverse order. So that is one of the elegance that we have with DES, or any sort of block cipher that is following the Feistel structure. So here what you can see is a DES example, an example of a DES operation or encryption. And what we have is, in the first row we have the values of this is the plain text, and here what we have is the plain text after the initial permutation. So we still have the initial permutation. After the initial permutation, we have the 32 bits there. Then what we do is we take the sub keys. We take a number of sub keys. We take 16 sub keys, and for each of those we produce the left and rights. So we'll go through the same round after 16 rounds, and then we will end up with the ciphertext. One of the other interesting properties that we expect from any ciphertext or any cryptographic algorithm is what we call as avalanche. So what is an avalanche? So that is, say, where, say, a small movement in a mountain results in a big landslide sort of a thing in a mountain. So that is avalanche. So a small change affects or results in a big change as a result. So in terms of encryption, what we expect in a good encryption algorithm is this property of avalanche. That is, if there's a small change in the plain text or a key, there should be a significant change in the resulting ciphertext. So if you change a single letter in the encryption or in the plain text, there should be a bigger change in the resulting ciphertext. So the difference between two plain text, if that is single letter, the difference in the ciphertext will be significantly larger. So that is one of the things that we have in DES. So it has a very good, strong avalanche property. The main advantage we will have when we have avalanche property is that guessing becomes very harder, because you cannot make small changes to the plain text and observe the differences to guess the key, for example, or the vice versa. So the avalanche property will ensure that guessing is much more difficult. So DES has that property, which is an advantage with that. Then when we think about the strength of DES, depending on the key size, for example, here we have 56-bit keys. So that is 2 to the power 56. That is this amount of possible values. So brute forcing that may seem a bit difficult, and it is difficult. And for example, in early 90s, it was the difficulty of breaking that in a brute force manner was, say in the 80s it was pretty impossible, but in the 90s, with the advancement of computing, it became a few months, and then became few days, and later on it became few hours. And at which point the strongness or strength of DES is no longer valid for many applications. So that is one of the issues with the DES. But then we went on to using a number of alternatives for DES, like either using double DES kind of operations, or like repeating multiple DES operations, or going for advanced encryption standard, or AES, as we would discuss next week. Then another issue relevant to the strength of DES is the analytical attacks. There are a number of different analytical attacks that can be performed on DES and that can be compromised. So these are ways that people will analyze the ciphertext and the plain text to gather the underlying key or underlying encryption structures and break the encryption. So that is what we mean by analytical attacks. So there are things like differential cryptanalysis, linear cryptanalysis, and related key attacks, and some of these are successful against DES. So again, there are some challenges in that sense as well. Then there are what are known as timing attacks. Timing attacks are basically when we can be depending on particular devices, and they produce certain encryption outcomes based on the information, like depending on the sub keys and how they do calculations, and depending on different times, they may produce different outcomes. So these attacks are actually on the implementation of the cipher, not about the keys or the basic structure of the cipher, but rather the actual implementation, how people may have implemented these ciphers, and identifying some vulnerabilities, identifying some issues in that, and then exploiting those. So this is fairly common in sort of smart card, or attacks on smart cards, or encryption on smart cards, and so on. So these are some of the issues that are there in DES. And as we said, the differential cryptanalysis is one of the ways these can be compromised. This was something that was known fairly early on, even in the 50s and 70s, when these Faisal structures and the DES was adopted as a standard. It was fairly well known, but in the earlier days, the the available resources, available computing resources were not suitable enough to perform these attacks, these cryptanalytic attacks in a successful manner, whereas they are more successfully used in against most sort of block ciphers these days because of these sort of powerful methods that are available these days. So with differential cryptanalysis, what we have is we will have some we will observe some differences between the different inputs and outputs, and with observing some probabilities and observing some of these sub keys, we can go through or we can infer some of these sub keys, and we can go through this process in a repetitive manner, and after a number of points we may be able to identify the underlying structures there. So that is differential cryptanalysis. We are not going to go into detailed discussion about these cryptanalysis methods. We may revisit them at a latter part in the course or in an advanced cryptography course later on. But in this context, the main thing to remember is there are some mechanisms like differential cryptanalysis or linear cryptanalysis that can be used for attack against these. So again, sort of linear cryptanalysis, again, DES is a fairly recent development, not too recent, again, sort of in the 90s, using certain statistical methods done over a number of rounds, and then you can find some approximations, and then you can break the encryption at the end of the day. And finally, when we sort of overall, when we think about DES overall, there are a number of sort of the basic design criteria is normally outlined in this particular report. But the main idea is we have S boxes, we have S boxes that provide non-linearity, that provide resistance against differential cryptanalysis, and they provide the confusion part. And then we have the P boxes or the permutation boxes that provide the diffusion part. So with DES, as we said, the two things that we expect from any sort of encryption or block cipher is the diffusion and confusion. So that is, we are doing a lot of substitutions, and then we are also doing permutations, and then we are repeating it over a number of cycles or number of rounds, and then as a result we get what we get is a much suitable suitable outcome in terms of a cryptographic algorithm. So when we think about the basic principles, or when we revisit the basic principles, as with 5-cell structures, the more rounds that we can have in a block cipher, that is best. So if we have 16 rounds, and then if we can have 32 rounds, that would be even better, because we will do more confusion, more substitutions. And then by adding confusion, we get nonlinear avalanche results. So that is, small changes result in bigger changes in the ciphertext, and then we use substitution boxes for that purpose. And then we use certain key schedules again to create sub keys. So each of these rounds will use sub keys. So rather than using the same key again and again, we will break that into a number of smaller sub keys, and that are what used in each of these rounds. And again, that gives us the advantage of what we can categorize as key avalanche. So again, small change in key will result in a significant change there as well. So as a summary, we briefly discussed the difference between block ciphers and stream ciphers, and the 5-cell cipher structure design, the left, right, that structure. Then we briefly talked about the operation of DES, the history of DES, and how the DES algorithm is designed, the encryption process, and the decryption process. Then we also touched upon some of the differential and linear cryptanalysis possibilities and how they can be compromising for some of these block cipher algorithms. So, as we said early on itself, DES is no longer the de facto standard. It is no longer the common standard for encryption. It has been eclipsed by advanced encryption standard, which we'll be discussing in a later lecture in this course. But DES itself, as an example to understand block ciphers, has an important place in studying principles of computer security. So, and that is the importance of today's lecture. And I would highly suggest you to refer some of the additional resources shared along with this lecture material to get a better understanding of the overall block cipher basics. So then you can better understand when we go into discussing AES or Advanced Encryption Standard. So until next time, if you have any questions, please reach out to me, and see you with another lecture in Principles of Computer Security. Thank you for joining, and bye.